Good evening. President Trump has arrived in London for the NATO meeting, promising not to get involved in the election campaign, before doing precisely that, saying he was a fan of Brexit and thought that Boris Johnson was very capable. He then added he could work with anybody in number 10. The election is just 9 days away. Mr. Trump also denied that the NHS would be on the table in any future trade talks with the UK. In a moment, our diplomatic correspondent James Robbins will have more on the NATO meeting. But first, our chief political correspondent Vicky Young looks at Mr. Trump's impact on the political scene. There are some flashing images coming up.
Donald Trump's in town, and there's a general election next week. Two things likely to make Boris Johnson's team pretty nervous. They're hoping for harmony. And the convention is that world leaders don't get involved in other countries' domestic affairs. But this president doesn't tend to play by the rules.
I've won a lot of elections for a lot of people.
Earlier, he couldn't quite keep his views to himself.
I'll stay out of the election. You know that I was a fan of Brexit. I called it.
And of course, he had an opinion about Britain's political leaders too.
I think Boris is very capable, and I think he'll do a good job.
Would you be able to work with a possible Prime Minister Corbyn? Or is that...
I can work with anybody. I'm a very easy person to work with.
Now in full flow, the president tackled another controversial issue.
Should the National Health Service be on the table in trade talks?
No, not at all. I have nothing to do with it. Never even thought about it. I don't even know where that rumor started. We have absolutely nothing to do with it, and we wouldn't want to. If you handed it to us on a silver platter, we want nothing to do with it.
Rewind 6 months, and it was a different story.
When you're dealing in trade, everything's on the table. So NHS or anything else, or a lot more than that.
He hastily retracted that comment, but opposition parties have been suspicious ever since.
Obviously, we want a good relationship with the USA, but the trade talks that have been undertaken by the government have been done in secret, and we do not accept any idea of US companies coming in to run our National Health Service, or the idea of extending the patents on medicine, which will increase the costs for our National Health Service.
Last week, Jeremy Corbyn produced papers showing talks about a UK-US trade deal took place when Theresa May was in charge. But there's no proof of negotiations about privatising the health service.
Categorically rule out that any part of the NHS will be on the table in any trade negotiation.
Including pharmaceuticals.
Including pharmaceuticals. This is pure Loch Ness Monster, Bermuda Triangle.
Mr. Johnson's focus today was on security, visiting Salisbury, where a former Russian spy was poisoned last year. This close to election day, Boris Johnson's team would prefer to be controlling events.
Rocky Road? Rocky 9 days.
I think that'll do.
And they can't guarantee that Donald Trump will go along with that. Now, Donald Trump is not the kind of man who is easily controlled, of course. He did come here for a reception tonight, but it was alongside all the other NATO leaders, and it does feel as if it's a matter of safety in numbers for Boris Johnson. There are no one-to-one meetings planned, certainly not in front of the cameras, no plans either for a joint press conference. And that's because the Conservative team know that a ringing endorsement from Mr. Trump right now is not necessarily a vote winner with everyone. I'm sure they'll be keeping a very close eye on the President's Twitter feed in the next 24 hours. And you get the sense from the campaign team for the Conservatives that they really just want to get through this summit and get back to day-to-day campaigning.
Vicky, many thanks again. Vicky Young, our chief political correspondent there in Downing Street with the latest. Well, divisions between NATO leaders have been exposed during the day. President Trump accused the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, of being nasty and disrespectful for describing NATO as brain dead. Mr. Macron defended his comments and highlighted differences with Turkey, which are threatening to derail efforts to set up a new missile defence system. This report from our diplomatic correspondent James Robbins does contain some flashing images.
Buckingham Palace and a birthday party for NATO leaders to celebrate their military alliance and 70 years' success keeping the peace through collective defence. Everyone on best behaviour for the Queen, but NATO is a family currently at war with itself. France's President Macron has been strongly critical of Donald Trump's isolationist role and called NATO strategically brain dead. Earlier in the day, he stood by those remarks, even after Mr. Trump rebuked him publicly.
When you make a statement like that, that is a very, very nasty statement to essentially 28, including them, 28 countries. I think that, you have a very high unemployment rate in France. France is not doing well economically at all.
In fact, the alliance faces another far larger threat to unity: the military action by NATO member Turkey inside northern Syria. Turkey's President Erdogan is enraged NATO isn't 100% supportive of his fight against Kurdish troops he brands terrorists. But President Macron completely rejects the Turkish position.
When I look at Turkey, they now are fighting against those who fight with us, who fought with us, shoulder to shoulder, against ISIS.
70 years ago, when NATO was established, it all felt so much simpler. The American-led alliance faced a single enemy: the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin. It was Soviet communism which eventually collapsed. NATO survived, but now struggles to agree its future role.
NATO is the most successful alliance in history because we have been able to change when the world is changing. That's exactly what we are doing again, and the fact is that we are doing more together in this alliance now than we have done for many decades.
But that sounds far too upbeat to those leaders who think the alliance has lost its way and is failing to face up to developing threats. So what are some of those future threats NATO has to face? Well, still from Russia, and there's talk now of China too. Not an adversary, NATO insists, but a worry nevertheless. And there's concern about possible future cyber attacks on satellites in space. How would NATO react to that? President Trump is now claiming success, pushing other states to increase their NATO spending and so reduce America's 70% share. But other splits over the way ahead won't be resolved in a few hours of formal talks tomorrow. James Robbins, BBC News at Buckingham Palace.